Good evening. Looks like everyone's having a good time. Glad to see that. So Dr. Cooper just pointed something out. He was disturbed by the image behind us. Was this a fireside chat or gateway to hell? I'm going with fireside chat. Okay. I have to say I'm so happy to be here tonight. 2 weeks ago I had my full left knee replaced. And my nurse out back there, my wife, Phil Wave, is so happy to get me out of the house tonight and have me here and not with her. So thank you all. So on behalf of the entire team here at Lexington, I just want to thank you for coming to this, what it is a client appreciation event. And it truly is. We're very appreciative for all of you. And you have made us what we are, and we have nothing but gratitude for everything you've done for us. So thank you very much. Lexington Wealth Management is a part of a firm called Hightower, which we joined 5 years ago and almost a month now ago. And they're our strategic partners in this endeavor. So Stephanie's both the Chief Investment Strategist at Hightower as well as the Head of Investment Solutions. So we've had a number of strategists that have sat in front of you guys over the years. And they kind of live up here in the clouds, and they'll talk about big picture things. And sometimes they're right and sometimes they're wrong. And it's not really measured. So you get to live up in the clouds and all that, but then at the end of the day, you're measured every day in what you do. Yes. So she brings that perspective, which we've never had in one of these meetings before, so I want to throw that out there. So something was recently written in our internal letter at Hightower, and it's called Stocks Don't Care. So there's bullets. It says, in 2020, there's a 2024 presidential election. I don't know if any of you know that coming up. There's been an assassination attempt. There's tension and war across the globe. Central banks are easing. The yen carry trade unwound this summer. It's now old news, but port strikes and, of course, natural disasters all over the country. And yet, through the end of the third quarter, the S&P was up 20.8%. How does that jive?
Well, first and foremost, I want to also thank you all for coming. I'm always humbled when people want to sit and listen to what I have to say. I hope I don't bore you too much. First and foremost, I would say the market always climbs a wall of worry. I worry when I don't worry, because that means you're complacent. I always want to know the other side, but for every negative, there is a positive. And so I just want to ask the audience, because I always like to take a pulse as to kind of where your head is at, where your mindset is at. How many of you think that we are headed for a recession in the next 6 months? Okay, that's interesting. So only a few. Okay, so but it is, even if it was zero, it's interesting because a year ago, if I were sitting here in this seat and I asked the same question, it was unanimous that we were headed for a recession. In January of last year, it was like 100% of the people thought we would be in a recession by now. Most people thought it was last summer. We grew 3.4% in GDP last year. That's like the best recession I've ever seen. We're growing 3.2% as of the third quarter, year over year in GDP now. That's impressive. So what did everyone get wrong? And people were worrying about recession all year long, and the market went up.
Pretty much every economist said the same thing, right?
I never said a recession. I thought slowdown.
Right.
And I thought slowdown because clearly the Fed raising interest rates from 0 to 5.5%, well, historically, that has slowed the economy down. It has worked in the past. But what people totally misunderstood and didn't respect was the amount of fiscal and monetary policies that were put in place over the last 5 years, starting at COVID. So if you add up fiscal policies and monetary policies that were put in place during COVID, it was 60% of US GDP. So let me give you just a reference point. Back in 2008, we had the great financial crisis. And let me tell you, it was really a crisis. We had some really big banks that failed. And if you add it up at that time, fiscal and monetary policies that were put in place back in 2008 was 5%. So we just put in 60% of GDP in terms of liquidity into this economy. And so it more than offset the higher interest rates from the Fed. It even surprised the Fed. The problem with all that stimulus is it led to inflation. We had 9% peak inflation at the very, very peak in CPI. I mean, you can look at a lot of different metrics, but 9%. No wonder why we had inflation and was so high, because you put so much money in, and it did. In addition to that, we had all kinds of problems with supply chains. We had all kinds of problems with China. And oh, by the way, most of the companies at that time, US companies, had supply chains in China. That is changing for sure, and that's a big theme we'll get to for sure about onshoring and reshoring. But that is the reason why we had kind of a problem. We had the growth, but we also had the inflation. So we had this Fed that was behind the curve because they didn't want to recognize that we had inflation. They said it was transitory, which was ridiculous. And so they then put the pedal to the metal and raised rates at a rapid, rapid pace in 18 months, 5.5%. And that's a big deal. So where do we stand now? Well, the good news is that the growth rate is still pretty strong. And I would, by the way, argue that we put in stimulus last year too. In the IRA, the infrastructure stuff that was passed, that was $2 trillion. That hasn't even gotten into the economy yet. If you talk to companies, they'll say they see it in terms of orders and backlog and that sort of thing, but it's not really, hasn't really taken off, because stimulus takes a long time to get into the economy. And so we have the growth now. Thankfully, we have inflation that has come down, running about 2.5%. I think it's going to stay stubborn at 2.5%. But why do we really care about this, the big picture strategy when I'm running money? Why do we really care? We care because if you have 2.5% growth in the economy, you have inflation coming down, you, oh, by the way, have a Fed that's all of a sudden now beginning a cutting cycle. I don't think it's going to be that aggressive, but it's beginning. That bodes well for earnings. And to answer your question specifically, that's why the market is higher. That's why we were higher last year, because earnings growth last year came in at about 8%. This year, you add it all up, when you have a 2.5% economy, you can grow revenues 5-6%. You can have margin expansion, which we have. And I am not in the camp that margins are about to roll over. In fact, I think margins are going to surprise to the upside. And so when you have decent growth, a little bit higher margins, that gives you that earnings growth, the operating leverage. And I think you're going to do something like 8 to 10% in earnings growth this year. And earnings have actually been revised higher. And there's one thing my good friend Larry Kudlow taught me 18 years ago. Stocks follow profits on the way up and on the way down. And right now, they're being revised up. And if I can say we're just beginning earnings season now, and it's a little bit of minutia for you, but I get all excited about it. The banks have started to report earnings. It has been 5, 6, 7 years since the banks have seen any kind of benefit from the yield curve steepening, meaning net interest income. They're bread and butter. They're lending businesses. And we're just beginning to see that. And if you get the banks, along with the technology sector, to do well, along with huge theme in onshoring and reshoring, and anything tied to power and anything tied to the grid, those are really powerful themes. And if I can leave you with one thing, you absolutely have to do some work on the grid infrastructure data center. Because if you believe in AI, which I do, I think we all probably do to varying degrees, but if you believe in that, you need to power the data center, you need 6 to 8 times the power that is already existing to get these data centers to work so that AI can work. So if you have a couple of themes in the marketplace, as well as a decent economy, as well as better earnings, that is why we're up 20%. And when people say, but the market is expensive, the market is expensive when you include technology. It's not all about technology. We are seeing a very exciting time right now where you're seeing kind of a broadening out in the marketplace. So yeah, you can own tech. I want you to own tech. I don't think you need to own 35% of your portfolio in tech, but that's what the S&P is. But you can own some tech, and we can talk about themes there too beyond AI. But there's other sectors that matter too. I think that's what's really kind of driving, at least in the short term, the markets higher.
Excellent. Covered a lot of turf there. So
I can keep going.
I'm gonna backtrack for a sec.
Go.
So I'm gonna be a little bit of a wet blanket here. So Jamie Dimon is someone that I listen to. I've heard him speak, and I listen to him. He's a pretty brilliant guy, I think. Right?
Absolutely.
I just heard him in New York a few weeks ago, and he's pessimistic on, he's been the rain cloud for the last couple of years, and he's been wrong so far. And he worries that inflation, although it's dipped, it's really coming back. And he cites reshoring as a issue, probably having to remilitarize the world with what's going on in the world. But so his take is that inflation may not be tame as we think it is. It may be resurging, showing its ugly head again a year or two down the road.
So I will tell you, I agree that 2.5%, 3% is kind of the base case for inflation, but it's because growth is better. So I will take better growth and a little bit higher inflation any day from an investment point of view, not from a consumer point of view. So from an investor point of view, if you have a little bit of inflation, that gives you pricing power. But I would also say that we haven't had productivity growth in this country for years, probably decades actually. And we're starting to see productivity improve. And oh, by the way, we can thank AI for that and technology for that. And I just mentioned technology is 35% of the S&P 500, the weighting. So productivity is important. If we get productivity, that's a good thing. And we have been seeing wages coming down a little bit, yet still elevated. So that's good for the consumer. We still have jobs out there. That's good for the consumer. Why do we root for the consumer? Because it's 70% of the US economy. And oh, by the way, all of you are sitting here tonight, thankfully, that most people want to get out and about. I was on a plane today, mob scene. Restaurants, mob scene. Hotels, the prices are crazy. Why do we care about that? Because services is a big component of consumption. It's 75% of consumption. So I hear you, I hear what Jamie is saying on inflation, but the consumer is able to handle it for the time being. Not all the consumers. The low end is having a challenge for sure. A lot of the times they do, unfortunately. But the mid-tier and the higher end, they are actually in pretty good shape. And I would just say, keep an eye on the job numbers. They're starting to weaken a little bit, but there's still 1.1 jobs available in this country for one unemployed person. At the peak of the tightness in the labor market, we got as much as 2.5 jobs that were open for one unemployed person. So we're slowing a little bit, but it's still a very healthy market. And I'll just give you one other thing about jobs, because it is so important. I look at this weekly jobless claims. Don't look at the weekly jobless claims. Let me do that. I look at a 4-week moving average of weekly jobless claims that get announced. And it's running at about 230,000. A year ago, it was at 200,000. We root for it to be low, right? Weekly initial claims, right? So recessions get as high as 350 to 375,000. So we're at 230,000 weekly initial jobless claims. That's still very, very healthy. So keep an eye on jobs, keep an eye on wages. Inflation comes down, gasoline prices are down 15% year over year. Consumer is in pretty good shape, and they're able to handle the inflation.
Just to be boots on the ground on that one, I belong to 2 CEO groups, companies ranging from 8 million to 100 million in revenue. And every one of them is trying to figure out how they're going to be using AI to help increase their productivity. So
on that note, I talk to chief technology officers at companies. Hightower, I talked to our own chief technology officer, and what they will tell you is where are they spending. They're spending double-digit growth, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a lot for a chief technology officer. Most of the time they have like a budget to spend like low single digits. So double-digit growth. So the 2 places that they're spending, one is AI, because they are trying to figure it out. They do not know what it means for their business yet. And the second place, which I think is even bigger than AI, cybersecurity. So when you have cybersecurity companies getting cyber attacks, that's a problem. And they are. And why is that? Because there are too many vendors out there. And this is what the CTOs tell me. Too many vendors that are out there, and they're not talking to each other. And most companies wanted a lot of vendors because they didn't want to have that concentration. But my bet is you're going to see massive consolidation because you have to have these vendors talk to each other. And that's why you're hearing companies talking about a platform, offering a whole bunch of things that all talk to each other. So I think the top 5 companies in cyber get bigger and bigger and bigger. But those are the 2 areas in technology that I think are really, really big. And cyber, I think, is way underestimated relative to the kind of the hype on the AI side.
Do you see why the CEO of Hightower told me to make sure we get her? So let's hear from Stephanie.
Thank you very much.